It is really important to use resources well. In this week's parasha, we're going to see that we shouldn't waste and we shouldn't underuse resources that we have. Where do we learn that from? Now, Rabbi Pasha saying, it says in our parasha, on the day that Moshe concluded putting up the Mishkan, he anointed it and sanctified it, and the Nesiim brought their contributions to initiate the Mizbeach. And part of the korbanos that they brought were they brought these 6 wagons and 12 cattle. And that's al shnei hanesim, agola al shnei hanesim, 1 wagon between every 2 nesim, b'shor le'echad, and each one brought a bull. They brought them in front of the Mishkan. Now, what are these wagons for? But there's a bigger question here, which is, it doesn't seem to make sense. Generally speaking, all the contributions the Jews made to the Mishkan were extremely generous, to the extent that they had not only enough, but they had more than enough of the materials they needed for the Mishkan. So therefore the question is, how could it be that the Nesiim, who's supposed to be the people setting the standard for the Jewish nation, they're the ones who brought a limited amount of these wagons? Each one only contributed half an agola. What kind of a contribution is that? 1 wagon per every 2 Nesiim. Beyond that, yes, okay. When you get a nidvas hanesim of a medrash, you'll know that the Sifri and Medrash point out about the Nesim. Rashi quotes it too. Ma ron and hanesim. How come the Nesim were first in line at this point of the contributions to the Mishkan? Because because they had an attitude that let everybody else contribute to the Mishkan, we'll fill in the gaps, and so they were not first in line to contribute the materials to the Mishkan. They said, whatever everybody else contributes, let them, and we'll fill in the rest. But when they saw that the community was really good at the contributions, and they gave everything that was needed, as the pasuk says, that there was sufficient materials, they said, okay, now what? Now how are we going to contribute to the Mishkan? So therefore, they brought the precious gems that were going to go into the Choshen breastplate and to the shoulder holders on the Kohen Gadol's shoulders. And the reason they did this is that's why here they came first in line, because they felt that they had done the wrong thing by waiting when contributing materials to the Mishkan. In other words, the contributions the Nesiim are making on this day, the day of the inauguration of the Mishkan, is supposed to somehow correct the fact that they did not contribute appropriately in the first place to the Mishkan. Here they want to express, look, we're contributing properly and with a full heart. So how do they go about showing we're contrite, we really want to fix up what we did? By giving half a wagon each. Doesn't make sense. What makes it even more confusing is, based on the simple understanding of the Pesukim, and in the Medrash, what was the purpose of these wagons and the oxen that were going to pull the wagons? Was to carry all the pieces of the Mishkan when they had to travel. That's actually what happened, as the Torah tells us, that Moshe then divided up those wagons between the families of Levim relative to their work in carrying the Mishkan. Gershon, their family got 2 wagons with 4 oxen. And Merari got 4 wagons and 8 oxen, and that's how they carried the Mishkan. Now think about it. We know how big the boards and the columns of the Mishkan were. So you can already extrapolate that they were very weighty. Plus the 100 silver bases that were used for the walls of the Mishkan, they weighed a lot. Every individual one of the Adonim was a kikar, which is a substantial amount of weight. Multiply that out. Especially when you go into the details of it, the Gemara tells us what the wagons looked like. That the whole length of 1 wagon was only 5 amos. And the width of the wagon was only 2.5 amos, and not very big. So the only way you could transport the boards of the Mishkan is you had to pile them up on top of each other. 12 boards, massive wooden boards of the Mishkan on each of the wagons. And not only was that difficult to place, but now, because of the way it was balancing on the wagons, you had to have a Levi who was coming along watching to watch it, nothing slipped off and fell. And throughout all of the journeys, this Levi, whose job it was to follow along behind the wagon. And if he saw that anything was starting to slide over, he had to run to the part that was sticking out and get to where the gap was. And he'd have to literally force the board back into place. So why set up a system like this that is so fragile? And that's only the boards. You still have to add the columns that were used to hold up the curtains around the Mishkan, Va'adonov, and the bases, so you have the columns of the Mishkan itself, the columns of the chotzer around the Mishkan, as well as the copper bases for those columns. All of that is supposed to only go on 4 wagons? So, this seems firstly impractical, and secondly to go against the principle that whatever happened in the Mishkan, the Beis Hamikdash, had to be done with extravagance. The Gemara tells us that they even gave the Tamid to drink from a golden cup, because in a place of wealth you don't do anything skimping and cheap. Had there been more wagons, you wouldn't have had to pile up the boards of the Mishkan on top of each other. And you would have removed the need and the pressure to have somebody watching the process as they were traveling. With a lady who has to tail the wagons as they're going in case anything falls, you could have alleviated all of that trouble just by having more wagons. And if this is the great contribution of the Nesim to show how much they care about the Mishkan, why is it so mitzumtzam? Why is it so limited? Okay, Rashi doesn't comment on it, which gives the impression that maybe within the pshat, simple understanding of the pasuk, there is already a solution, and that solution might be as follows. Early on in Parshas Truma, we had a question: where did they get wood from in order to build the Mishkan? The fact that they had this shittim wood in order to build the Mishkan. Rashi says, how did they get wood in the middle of the Midbar? Rabbi Tanchuma famously tells us that Yaakov Avinu saw with Ruach HaKodesh, Hasidim Yisrael leaving this Mishkan B'Midbar. In the future, the Jewish people are going to build a Mishkan in the Midbar. So he brought these cedar trees down to Mitzrayim. And planted them. And he told the Jewish people, when one day you leave Mitzrayim, take this wood with you. You're going to need it in order to build a Mishkan. So we know that they had wood, which also means they only had a finite amount of wood. So despite the fact that when the Jews left Mitzrayim, and again at the time of Kriyas Yamsuf, they got an incredible amount of wealth and gold, silver, and precious jewels. So any of that's needed for the Mishkan, they have in abundance. People be gedulim b'meshach masayim v'eseshonim v'lekichasim imayim midbar. But how did they have wood in the midbar? Only because Yaakov Avinu had the foresight to bring wood down into Mitzrayim, planted. People had to look after those trees for 210 years. Then they obviously had to cut them down and take it with them in the midbar. And that wood was now required for all of the elements that were wood-based in the Mishkan. Which would explain that they kept the wagons to a minimum, because you only have so much wood. You don't have an abundance of wood like you have an abundance of gold and silver. Maybe that's the answer. Why did the Nesim do this? Because there was not a lot of wood to go around, so they had no choice but to limit the amount of wagons. Is that a good explanation? It's not a good explanation. It's a difficult explanation, because the fact is, the Nesim wanted to come forward to donate these wagons. They were not mandated by Hashem what the wagons have to be made out of, so they don't have to be shittim wood. So yes, you have a limited supply of shittim wood. Great, find another wood. But you're telling me that in Egypt there was no other wood, there were no other trees in the whole of Egypt, that they couldn't find any other wood. Yes, for the Mishkan you need atzei shittim, fine. So that's limited to what Yaakov Avinu brought from Israel. But other wood you could have taken, anticipating that you're probably going to have wagons. And plus the Midrash tells us that there were traveling merchants who used to come past and Jews traded with them while they were in the Midbar. What's the big deal to ask a trader to bring you some wood? Maybe it'll take a few weeks, even months, but you can get it. Let's try another angle. Besifri, the Sifri in the Midrash, Lomdu me'aposel kach me'itom, they learn from the pasuk that says, take from them, that bo v'amdid fnei Mishkan, v'loi kibel Moshe mehen ad shenemar loi mipi hakodesh kach me'itom. The idea of kach me'itom means that every person would bring their intended contribution to the Mishkan, and the Eivishter would then have to green light Moshe to say, you can accept this item from this person. In other words, which means that whoever was contributing to the Mishkan, specifically over here when we're talking about the Nasim, right? You have to take from the Nasim, all these things, means the Nasim had to kind of align with what the Eibishter wanted, and then that's what was going to be used for the Mishkan, which means that the Nasim had some kind of an intuition that this is how many agolos we need. The contribution of these wagons to carry the Mishkan was obviously proposed by the Nasim, but aligned with Hashem's intention, or Memela Gam Isparan, which includes the fact that the amount of wagons that it was obviously aligned with what Hashem wanted. Very similar to the karbonos the Nasim are about to bring to initiate the Mizbeach. Many of the details of those karbonos, which are spelled out by Rashi and Chazal, they were temporary instructions. For example, the concept of an individual nasi bringing keteris, which is usually reserved for the Kohen Gadol on behalf of the whole community. And the fact that keteris was not brought where it's normally brought inside the heichal, but was brought on the outer mizbeach. Something that's never repeated elsewhere. And needless to say, anything that they were doing temporarily in the process of inaugurating the Mishkan was obviously sanctioned by Hashem and through Moshe, obviously. And so logically, that probably applied to the wagons as well. That's why those are the amount of wagons, because that's what the Eibishter wanted. Even though it's the Nasim who are doing this work and providing these wagons, like the pasuk says, "Vayakrivu hanasim," that the Nasim brought the wagons. But as we've illustrated, Moshe is not going to accept something until Hashem gives it the green light. So the Nasim bring their karbonos. When Hashem says yakrivu, bring those karbonos, that's now considered as if it's the Eibishter instructing. Same logic would apply to the wagons. Yes, it's the Nasim who initiated the idea of the wagons, but once the Eibishter says go ahead and bring those wagons, that becomes like as if Hashem has instructed it. So maybe that's why that's the amount of wagons, because that's what Hashem wanted. The problem with that theory is it's a bit far-fetched to say that there's some super-rational reason why the wagons have to be only a certain amount, but without any explanation. In fact, especially when it seems to fly in the face of any rational explanation, why would that be? Especially when you consider that it was first the Nasim who came up with the idea of how many wagons to have, and then only after that did they discover, actually that's what Hashem endorses as well. As we said, the karbonos that the Nasim brought in order to initiate the Mizbeach were unusual karbonos never to be repeated, brought in a manner that was never to be repeated. Now we know, we can say that was unique, it was only for that particular time. Have a look, Rashi points out straight away, the numbers and the types of karbonos that they brought all symbolize things. As Chazal explained to us. So there has to be some kind of logical follow-through to the story of the wagons. There has to be some kind of logic. Why there were so few wagons and so few oxen? Why? There's got to be a reason behind it. Especially reminding ourselves that this seems to go contrary to the principle about the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash, which is a place of wealth and abundance and extravagance, which really should have applied also to the wagons. They should have been in abundance. We see this clearly in the Gemara as well. Look, the Gemara told us the exact size of these wagons. They had to be exactly 5 amos long, 2.5 amos wide. No longer, no wider. They had to be the exact size that a board from the Mishkan would fit perfectly on them. There should be no extra area around the kroshim. Clearly, if the Gemara is making us aware of that, there's got to be a reason. So even the principle that the length of the wagon should be 5 amos, the Gemara asks, why so big? We could have actually fitted 4.5 amos. You still could have got the kroshim on. And the answer is that there shouldn't be, so to speak, like pressure on the boards and how they're stacked. They had a similar question about the width, where the width of the wagon is wider than the width of the kroshim. And there the answer is because we don't want the kroshim kind of slipping off. So clearly there's a reason why these wagons have to be so limited, and we have to discover what that reason is. To get to answer this, we're going to see that the Sifri and the Medrash both describe the story of why it is that the Nasiim were, so to speak, so enthusiastic here, but late to the party when it was time to contribute the materials to the Mishkan. So when you look at the difference between how the Sifri and the Medrash describe this, it will give us a lot of insight. Sifri Isa, first the Sifri says, and how come here the Nasim are the first in line to contribute? But when it was time to contribute materials for the Mishkan, they were not first in line. Rashi has similar language where he says that, why here were they first in line? The Medrash has a different expression. It says, how come the Nasim were so, on the ball, they were so bezrizos, they had so much energy and enthusiasm to contribute first over here, whereas at the time of contribution to the materials of the Mishkan, they were lazy, and they only rocked up at the end. What's the very nuanced difference in language over here? So what's the messaging in this different language? So perhaps one of the distinctions is Sifri, which is similar to Rashi, according to the Sifri, these wagons and these oxen do not fall into the category of a korban. Whereas the Medrash says they are a korban. Listen to the words, harehim lehakriv. Because the Medrash used the expression lehakriv, which is obviously not only to bring clothes, but it's also an expression of korban. Begeder korban, kilushain akasim mamish vayoviu es korbanim, and that fits with the pasuk. The pasuk says they brought their korban sheishek lo yitzov. What was the korban? These wagons. As the Medrash continues, when the Mishkan was concluded, they quickly brought a korban. And that's why the pasuk says vayakrivu. So the Medrash is identifying the wagons as a korban. Gam also in this context we're going to find later on. So Moshe was concerned when these wagons arrived. What happens if one of the wagons broke in some fashion? Or what happens if one of the oxen would die? That would then disqualify the korban, there's the word again, of the Nasim. So the pasuk therefore says that David said, they will be, Hayu is a promise. Nita lemavoyo shiyu kayomim lo'ilam. The Eibusha guarantees they will survive. They'll make it through the 40 years in the desert. Everything will be good. And the Medrash there continues, eventually, what happens to these oxen is they end up becoming a korban in one of the locations where the Mishkan was eventually set up. In other words, from a midrashic perspective, there are two ways we could interpret the story. In the same medrash, at the beginning it says, to bring and to be makriv. In other words, we're talking about the person. The person has to step up, lehakriv, the person has to bring something, it's his obligation, the nasi, to bring this item as a contribution to the Mishkan. Whereas the second part of the medrash, which starts analyzing the kashrus of what is being brought, where there's a fear that maybe it would be disqualified as a korban, then we're not just describing a person making a contribution to the Mishkan, which is like a korban. In the latter part of the Mishkan, we're saying the item is a korban. It has some of the rules of a korban. It's not allowed to have the equivalent of a mum, be broken in any way. But what's clear is that this contribution, similar to a korban, is no more than 6 wagons. Even though that's very cheap, limited. And this is the opposite of the general way in which we treat the Mishkan, which is with opulence and extravagance, and that applies both to the wagons and to the oxen pulling the wagons. They're very limited. And the question is why? You're bringing a korban. Why such a limited korban? The explanation is this. After the Medrash gets into that detail, where the Nasim say, what can we contribute? They decided they're going to bring wagons, which will be used to carry the Mishkan. Then the Medrash says something interesting. Whose idea was this? Who gave them the idea to bring these wagons? Shevet Yisachar. Because Shevet Yisachar said to them, and the next words are going to be really important, Mishkan sha'asisim porechu ba'avir. What, are you going to leave the Mishkan just kind of hanging in limbo? And it's not agolos. Rather, what you should do is come forward, donate agolos, and they will be used to carry the Mishkan. What's it saying? Porech ba'avir, that the Mishkan is, it's like suspended in animation. What does it mean? The Medrash is illustrating over here that it's not just some kind of a superficial aspect of the Mishkan, that you have to have a practical way to transport the Mishkan, so you need wagons. Rather, the Medrash is pointing out part of the definition of what makes a Mishkan is if it is transportable, and therefore you need these wagons. Without the wagons, the Mishkan is floating in limbo. The purpose of these wagons is not just technical and practical. We need a transportation method, so we're going to use wagons. They will change and complete the process of making a Mishkan. The Mishkan is not a Mishkan until it is transportable. Why? For a really logical reason. Because the idea of the Mishkan is it's supposed to be structured like a tent. In order to be a Mishkan, it cannot be a permanent structure. The whole design of the Mishkan is a portable sanctuary that Jews can take with them on their journeys through the desert. Therefore, I recall, if there's no wagons, no means of transportation, and you now have no way to get the Mishkan to the next place, you don't have a Mishkan. A Mishkan is supposed to be portable. If there's no way to transport it, it's not portable, it's not a Mishkan. The Mishkan is floating in limbo because it hasn't yet been defined as a Mishkan. All of these there with that logic. It's not that the Nasim are saying, oi, we didn't contribute to the Mishkan, we better chaparayin quickly now and bring something along. It's that the Nesiim are saying, we need to be part of building the Mishkan, and part of building the Mishkan is going to be these agolas. Very similar to what they achieved by bringing their korbanos for the first 12 days of Nisan. Once they had brought their korbanos at the beginning of Chodesh Nisan, the Mizbech was now functional. They completed the requirements to get the Mizbech to a functional level. Now you could bring all the other korbanos. By them inaugurating the Mizbech with their korbanos, they actually completed the process of making a Mizbech. Till then it was just a structure. Now that structure becomes a Mizbech. So bringing along these wagons for the Mishkan does for the Mishkan similar to what the korbanos of the Nesiim did for the Mizbech. Now it becomes a Mizbech because it's had its initial korbanos. Now it becomes a Mishkan because it's portable. The wagons with the oxen pulling the wagons, that concludes the process of making a Mishkan. Very interesting perspective. Now move on. Now that we know this information, that these wagons are not just a side act, but they are critical to making the Mishkan into what it needs to be. So now we can understand, when it comes to building the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash, as we've mentioned, there's extravagance, there's beauty, there's opulence. There was nothing, not even the minutest detail in the Mishkan that was not used fully. Here's an interesting halachic perspective. If I would have a spare part in the Mishkan or the Beis HaMikdash that's not being used, that would be similar to bringing something that is not holy into the Beis HaMikdash, which is reserved for holiness. If it's an excess piece of something, then it doesn't belong in the Mishkan. It's actually wrong to have it there. So if that's how the Beis HaMikdash and the Mishkan are, that they are supposed to be so well calibrated that every single detail is used to the fullest, now that we understand that the wagons and the oxen are actually part of the Mishkan, they must be held to the same standard, which is no extras. Just like the Mishkan, everything is measured perfectly, so the wagons also have to be measured perfectly. No less than what we need, but also no more than what we need. Which means there should be nothing in this environment of wagons and oxen, not one thing that's not actually being used to transport the Mishkan. That applies to quantity. Only 6 wagons and only the specific size of wagon. Not more wagons, not bigger wagons. The same restrictions will apply to the amount of cattle pulling the wagons, despite the fact that the Mishkan is going to actually end up being a very heavy thing to transport. We need to make sure that every ox is pulling to the fullest power of its ability. If you have a whole lot of extra oxen, nobody's working to full capacity. And everything in the Mishkan has to be full capacity. So if there were more wagons, more oxen, not only would I have the problem of excess, which is not really being used as part of the Mishkan, but I wouldn't be having the correct shiur of agolis. Not only do I have extra stuff, every one of these wagons is not pulling its weight. As the pasuk, which would appear to be even an additional pasuk in the Torah, tells us, tells us exactly what the amount, the quantum was of everything that was contributed, which tells us not only was there the correct amount of material, the correct amount of utensils, but the weight of every utensil was specific. First, each one had to be weighed independently. Then there had to be the overall weight of all of the kelim. Nothing extra, nothing diminished. As the halacha tells us that in order for a kli sharis to be sanctified as a kli sharis, it has to be full, meaning it has to be used to the fullest extent. Let's take it a step further. All of this has been built on the principle that the Medrash illustrated, lehakriv, that these wagons and the oxen pulling the wagons already have the halachic status of a korban. Which is why there can be no excess. Masa HaMishkan, their job is carrying the Mishkan, can't be anything extra, can't be anything short, as we've just explained. That's all from the perspective of the Medrash that called it a korban. Avol. There's still the other opinion, Avol Adas HaSifri. The opinion of the Sifri, which is Valderech the Pirush Rashi, what Rashi says as well. They said that the purpose of these wagons was to carry the Mishkan without taking the angle that they had the halachic qualification of a korban. According to this shita, why does it have to be only 6 wagons? And why only 12 oxen? Masa HaMishkan, the answer to that is that carrying the Mishkan that is part of the responsibility of the Levim. It was their job to transport the Mishkan. As it says in the beginning of our parasha, their job was to work in the Mishkan and to carry the Mishkan. We see the same thing with Merari. This is what they had to carry. They had to carry the boards in the Mishkan. So it's the responsibility of Levim to transport the Mishkan. Now what does that mean? What do they actually have to do? Move on. So when the Eibishter said, accept these agolas from the Nesiim, and they will be to the service of the Oyel Moed. So give the wagons to the Levim to work with in their responsibilities. So what happened over here? Was it that previously the Levim were supposed to carry the Mishkan, but now the Nesiim came forward and they gave wagons, so we say to the Levim, okay, we no longer need your services, we're going to put it all onto the wagons. So is that Shikdushas HaLevim? Are we undermining now the sanctity of the Levim? Obviously not. And we're not trying to undermine their responsibilities. The responsibility of carrying and transporting the Mishkan remains the Levim's responsibility. Load, offload, set up, dismantle, carry. We've actually seen this. The Gemara tells us, the Medrash told us that when they are transporting the parts of the Mishkan, there have to be Levim accompanying those wagons in case anything starts to shift, so they're still involved. The only reason that there are these wagons is to make the Levim's schlep a little bit easier. So what the Sifri and Rashi will be telling us is that even when you have wagons, it's not considered like the wagons are carrying the Mishkan, it's considered like the Levim are carrying the Mishkan. That's why the Nesiim had this intuitive insight that they only brought 6 wagons, which is clearly what the Eibishter wanted, and the very heavy load that Bnei Merari had to carry was only spread over 4 wagons. Why? Because they needed to make it that it was not comfortable and easy, that you had to have Levim on duty accompanying the agolos to make sure nothing falls off. And a Levi had to be there on guard, that if anything starts to slip, he's got to get in position and put it back where it belongs. Why? Because the people carrying the Mishkan are the Levim. It's their mandate, it's their responsibility. It's just that we made it a little bit easier for them by having the assistance of the agolos of the wagons. So therefore, from the perspective of the Medrash, the reason why they are very specific amounts and limited amounts of wagons and oxen is because it's like everything else in the Mishkan, no excess that's going to go to waste, and everything has to be used to its fullest strength. According to the Sifri and Rashi, the reason it's so limited is so the Levim still play a vital role in the transportation of the Mishkan, because that's really their job. Which leaves us with lessons. Amr Chazal, Kol Mashabara Kodesh Baruch Hu B'Ei Lamai Lebara Davar Echel Levatol. Chazal tell us, whatever the Eibishter created in the world, nothing was created without a purpose. Uklal Zalmer B'Chol Zman U'B'Chol Mokim. That applies at all times, in all places. B'Chol Chelkei U'Prate Habriya, in every single facet of creation. Bases HaMishkan, so when they made the Mishkan, Kashan Iskaim Bosel Gan Lignuni, which allowed the Eibishter to manifest in his place of pleasure, in his garden here on earth. After the generations of people who had created barriers between themselves and pushed the Shechina out of their reality because of their Averas. Eventually now, at the time of the Mishkan, the Shechina returned to earth and dwelt in the Mishkan, as the Pasuk says, make the Mikdash, and that's where the Shechina is going to be. So that means when the Mishkan is now concluded, you can see that there's no detail in this Mishkan that is extra. You can identify in every single part of the Mishkan. This is why the Eibishter created gold, and this type of gold, and this amount of gold. That's why he created silver, etc., etc. That's why even though the Mikdash, whether it's the Mishkan or the Beis HaMikdash, is a place of extravagance, of opulence, there's no waste. What you see when you watch the Mishkan in action is every single thing used to the ultimate purpose of its original created intention. Therefore, because it is possible to carry the Mishkan using only 6 wagons pulled by 12 oxen that have the right dimensions, there's no purpose in adding to that. If there are additional components, use it elsewhere in the Mishkan. Don't overcompensate in this particular place of the Agolas. Which teaches us a lesson about us creating our own home for the Eibishter within our own lives. As Chazal famously tell us, when the Eibishter says, make for me a Mishkan and I will dwell within you, it never says I'll dwell in that place, it says I'll dwell within you, which means that we have a requirement to build our own personal Mishkan inside every single Jewish people. So what do we learn? The lesson over here is how careful we have to be that every resource, every talent that the Eibishter gave us, of a chol protov, and all the details within every one of our abilities, should not, God forbid, be wasted. Every facet of our beings has to be used to the max to do what the Eibishter wants, to serve Him. This applies to every one of our faculties. All of Ladas we have to know. Let's say, for example, the person studying Torah, without investing the capacity intellectually that they have and the investment of energy that they have, well, in that case, the person would not be using their talents in this particular area to the fullest extent. And the same applies to every one of our talents. That every one of our talents has to be used, directed towards the Eibishter, and to see and experience the Eibishter in everything we do. That everything we should be engaged in doing mitzvahs in the best possible way, and particularly to share Yiddishkeit and Chassidus everywhere. That's the lesson. Nothing should go to waste. Everything has to be used to the max. The ox has to pull the full amount that it could pull. I need to contribute the full amount that I can contribute. The same applies to time. Even if a person has filled 23 hours, 59 minutes of the day with meaning, we still have the responsibility to push to ensure that that last remaining minute does not go to waste. That's the lesson from the Mishkan. If you have excess that doesn't serve its purpose in the best possible way, the entire Mishkan would be lacking. And if the Mishkan is in any way lacking, then the manifestation of godliness is lacking. Which means for us, kasha Yehudi machsir mashu b'nitzul prat. If a Jewish person misses the opportunity to use something, even one tiny, tiny facet of the world in which we live, and that element of our lives goes to waste, that creates chaos in Eibishter's creation. Because the Eibishter created the world that nothing is to go to waste. So if chas v'shalom, a person wastes something, undermines the whole process of creation. Whereas on the other hand, if a person invests every bit of themselves to fulfill the requirements to serve the Eibishter, then that person will experience godliness revealed in their life, and by extension in the rest of the world. Because when every facet of creation is fulfilling the reason for which it was created, then that reveals in every tiny little piece of the world how this is the Eibishter's creation. And that will bring about the construction of the third Beis Hamikdash. And in that Beis Hamikdash, the Mishkan will manifest because the Moshe Rabbeinu's Mishkan is eternal. With all the details. That should be manifested in the third Beis Hamikdash that Mashiach will build. There won't be one wasted moment, but rather we'll have the exodus of our Golus, like there was the exodus of the Golus from Mitzrayim, find without any delay, even like the blink of an eye, by the Eibishter, miyad, mamash, rather, the Eibishter should send Mashiach literally right now.